Hey everyone. Today I wanted to talk about something a little bit different. Normally I talk about a movie or TVs, but today sometimes you get a little intersection where stuff that you're watching and stuff you're reading, you just see that there's a little trend going on, a new way of looking at pop culture, and often it's just got some minor waves, sometimes even bigger waves, which are going through society generally. And I find with science fiction and horror, sometimes they're a little bit ahead of the curve because they can comment on things in a way in which normal fiction sometimes has a bit of a problem. So today I want to start with talking about the sequel to Jordan Peele's Get Out. And when I say sequel, it's not a sequel per se, but it's his next project, which will be an adaptation of a novel called Lovecraft Country. Now, Get Out, I should say, spoilers for a couple of books, some of them nearly 100 years old, but for the film Get Out, I'm not going to spoil it per se, but I'm going to talk maybe thematically about it. But really, if you haven't seen it, I would say that it's probably the best film I've seen this year. And what I mean by that is I'm in Australia, so we often get the Oscar films in January, and they were great. But since then, I think the best film I've seen is Get Out. And I think Get Out will be talked about in 10 years, whereas apart from acting classes, you're probably not going to be talking about Manchester by the Sea. And the reason is because Get Out was just a great film, a classic horror film, but it started to talk about some things thematically about where horror and the way we debate and talk about race intersect. And you can then talk about it in a way which is very different to a straight up drama. So I'm just going to give you the premise of Get Out. This is the beginning of the movie is a black guy going out with a white girl, and for the first time, she's going to take him home to meet the parents. So already you've got this existential kind of dread about that's just going to be so awkward. And then what happens is we start to find out a little bit more about this universe and well, it's a horror movie, but I'm not going to say much more about that, but just that Jordan Peele of Key and Peele fame both wrote and directed this, and he wrote it over the last couple of years where in America with the Black Lives Matter movement, the Ferguson, Missouri shooting, and numerous other events all around America were all coming to a head just before the Trump election. And so he wrote during that time about the racial politics in a way which really hadn't been done before, apart from maybe some documentaries and straight up journalism. So he is now being picked to do this new adaptation of a book by Matt Ruff called Lovecraft Country. So that gives me an opportunity to show you this, which is more now switching from film nerd to book nerd. And this is my copy given to me by one of my best friends, Grant Chapman, a long, long time ago when I was in a bad place. And it's a first edition, first printing, H.P. Lovecraft, The Outsiders and Others. And it's probably the most seminal work of horror fiction ever. And certainly in the 20th century, I mean, there'd be works by H.G. Wells and Frankenstein and that which really set up the world of science fiction and horror. But this did something very different because H.P. Lovecraft talked about a world in which the horror came from outside. It was what is now known as cosmic horror and is really at the bedrock of weird fiction. And what was so great about it was that really in the works of H.P. Lovecraft, the protagonist or the hero could never win. The best they could do was to forestall the doom of mankind. And that had not really ever been done in this way. And he created a pantheon of old gods. And it's just a magnificent book. But the thing about H.P. Lovecraft is because he was such a weird person psychologically, xenophobic, germophobic, did not like women, and an out-and-out racist. So he was able to write about these protagonists who were outside society. And then what has happened has been people who are in minority cultures have been attracted by the works of H.P. Lovecraft and all the people who followed, and yet at the same time appalled by his inherent racism. So what do they do with this kind of work in which there's these two tensions working, together at the same time? And then you bring in Jordan Peele, and he's now been attached to direct and make a TV show based on Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff. So just going to have a break, and then we're going to talk about Lovecraft Country. Right, so this is Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff, and this is the book which the new TV series that Jordan Peele is going to make is attached to. And the interesting thing about Lovecraft Country is that it is set. Lovecraft Country is known as really the northeast of America, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont. And but really it's not a geographical place. It's also a kind of plane of existence in which these other creatures, these pantheons of old gods, can intersect with the earth. And it's just a catchphrase for a place where weird things can happen. So what Ruff has done is he's created a family of characters. They're all the Turner family, essentially. And it's not going to be spoiling anything to set up that they intersect with this world and with the old gods, or it's not clinically Lovecraft, like they don't mention Cthulhu or Azathoth or anything like that. What they do is they set up a world in which that could exist, and then there are this black family who, through various machinations, get involved with this. But the interesting thing with Lovecraft Country is there's this weird fiction going on at the exact same time as the Turner family are producing. The way they earn their money, their family business, is they produce a version of a real thing which existed, which is like a safe traveling guide to the Americas for black people. And so this was a real guide that people could look at, especially in the 50s, where it would say you could go to this hotel, you could eat at this restaurant, you could go to this shop without being racially prejudiced against. And I guess right now we probably do have a bit more of an idea of how that world would have existed. There was a time when, I think for me, from about the 80s onwards, where I never thought of America that way. But this is set in the 50s, in the time which we called normally the Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws are, if you think about after the Civil War, the black people are given ostensibly they're freed from slavery, but there's just so much societal impetus to just either keep them under, if not slavery, indentured slavery of some sort, and to not get their full voting rights, etc., etc. And so the Jim Crow laws meant that it was very unsafe for a black person, especially in the South, but even in the North, where it might not be completely physical violence, but it would nevertheless mean very hard for someone to, gain the best of their potential and all these other things. So Lovecraft Country looks at this intersection between the cosmic horror and the racial horror of America, and the two collide. And it's very interesting because what happens is, for the black protagonist, the two are just as deadly. Whereas normally when people write horror and write about Lovecraft, you know that the cosmic horror is the worst thing you could think of. But these people are having to navigate both simultaneously. Now, I actually don't think the book is that great. But if you've ever read Godfather and then seen the movie The Godfather, you'll know that sometimes a pulpier book can have really good characters, some really nice arcs, which probably lend themselves more to a film or TV. And I actually think that Lovecraft Country is perfect for TV, perfect for Jordan Peele, because it's really more a series of short stories with one big bad story arc overarching it. And also you could see how they could do one series and, use a lot of the book and then just come up with just really good stories going on from then on. So I do think that Jordan Peele's on the way, and I think that he will really be able to, especially after Get Out, play with that tension between these two worlds. Right, so the other thing I wanted to talk about is, so we've talked about Get Out and the sequel, and then also H.P. Lovecraft Country. And the other thing I wanted to talk about and mention it right now, because I've just read this, which is The Ballad of Black Tom, and that's by Victor Laval. And it is also an exploration of H.P. Lovecraft, the world of weird fiction, and the black experience in America, and again, how these worlds can collide. Now, this is a much better book, and what I really like about it is that H.P. Lovecraft, who is famous for being racist, his most racist story generally is considered The Horror at Red Hook. And that dates from a time when HPL lived actually in Brooklyn, New York for a very short time. And there's a famous story, he would walk in the middle of the road rather than on the sidewalks where it was surrounded by foreigners and black people, because he just was so xenophobic about anyone from any other kind of environment. And what The Ballad of Black Tom does is it takes a seemingly normal black guy who's just trying to make it in America, in New York, and writes him into the horror at Red Hook. Now, in the horror at Red Hook, 100-year spoiler almost, it's a story in which the hero is, the white cops and all that, and there are some black people in the story. And what Laval does is turns it on its head and tells the story really from this black protagonist. And who are the bad guys? The white cops are just as bad as, any of the villains or the cultists. And what it does, which is great, is if you're a black person in America at that time, this is set more in the kind of 30s, really, if you're going to be fighting against nearly everyone in society, and you've got monsters and white cops and white society, well, really, what's the difference? They're all out to get you. And who are the real monsters then? You might as well, if you get an opportunity to join a cult in which you might become incredibly powerful, and we consider that evil in the world of weird fiction, for a black guy, that might actually be the smart move.